What I'm going to do now is I'm going to introduce our first speaker. So for those of you who were here last year, this speaker will be no stranger to you, and possibly for those of you who are tuned into this space anyway, you will know Professor John Barry. John is Professor of Green Political Economy and Director of the Centre for Sustainability and Just Transitions, there's a mouthful, at Queen's University Belfast. Welcome back, John. It's great to have you here.
That's great. Good morning, everybody. And I'm delighted to be with you all this morning. Greetings from County Down in the north of the island. So can somebody just the usual, let me shout out if you can see my slides okay? Great. So I'm going to give you a rather whistle-stop tour as to why we need to start questioning growth. And the issue here is growth beyond the threshold. I mean, as Colette said, growth is good. It can provide lots of opportunities, particularly when you're starting from a poverty base or a low development base. So all my remarks I make this morning are directed at what I call the overdeveloped world. So I am not talking about Africa. I'm not talking about Asia or parts of South America. It is really at North America and Europe in particular, Australasia and Japan, where about 15% of the world's family lives. And the issue here is this nice definition. The earth isn't growing, you know, as Colette said, you know, we have a reluctance, but it is beginning to happen about accepting the finiteness of the planet. The planet isn't growing. And in a way, growth is a linear development path that is out with the biophysical regenerative cycles and regenerative cycles of resources coming back after we use them. So growth in a way is unnatural after a threshold. Again, back to that issue of thresholds. And so the main issue here I want to talk about is based on some of my work. I've been doing this for the last 30 years. I'm going to draw upon an academic article I published a few years ago of questioning orthodox, that's a GDP, gross domestic product. It's the term most of you be familiar with in the media and so on about how's the economy doing. And I'm going to talk about undifferentiated economic growth, in that growth does not make a distinction between whether or not you're buying £100 worth of alcohol or £100 worth of Bibles. From a pure, economic point of view, growth is growth and money is money. So that's what I mean by undifferentiated. There is no moral or political or other distinctions made in the economy. You can be purchasing goods and services that add to human happiness, and you can also be purchasing goods and services that actually create more social strife. The economy doesn't care. It's amoral, and that's part of the problem. So that's the undifferentiated element of our GDP measurements of economic growth. But also this issue of thresholds. Why should growth be a permanent feature of the economy as opposed to being a contingent and historically necessary stage of development? If you think about it, nothing in nature grows forever, not least human beings. You start off as a child, you grow then into an adolescent and into an adult, and you stop growing, although I probably speak for some of us here on the call where I've noticed my own tummy growing quickly since lockdown. But generally speaking, growth reaches a certain point and you mature, and then you reach what's called homeostasis or a steady state. Whereas our economic system has this continuous growth dynamic, which is, of course, the problem that we're looking at. So I'm not going to be able to go through all of these 4 points that I think we need to bear in mind in questioning economic growth. I think the most obvious one is that on a finite planet, and we're already seeing, the Earth's atmosphere heat up now to just over 1.1 degree, and we have heat waves around the world. As we speak, we have unprecedented heat waves now beginning to happen in parts of Asia, and even in France now they are reaching record-breaking heat waves and so on. So that's the first issue, is that we haven't enough planet to be able to continue this growth dynamic, particularly for every part of the world. I also will make the argument that economic growth doesn't solve socioeconomic inequality. It actually requires it and reproduces it. And there's a point beyond which growth does not actually add to human flourishing. It actually causes more social and other disbenefits than it does actually provide solutions and benefits. And then the last one I'll just mention here is that my own argument would be that after a point, actually economic growth begins to be a corrosive influence on our democracies. You know, whether it's on the one hand, turning most of us from active citizens into passive consumers or docile workers, or the fact that most workplaces where the production, where the economy, the engine of the economy is located, these are mini despotisms. Many of us have experience of work environments where there's no democracy. It's a hierarchical command and control system. And the reasons for that are in part to do with the fact that production is orientated towards efficiency, maximization, and therefore that's a non-democratic way of organizing production in the workplace is useful for maximizing production. But if you're interested in trying to bring democracy into the workplace, you have to have another logic of production, which would be more around sufficiency, a sense of enoughness, and so on, which I know my colleague Anne Ryan will be talking about in a moment. So what I'm going to argue here is a rather provocative idea, is that growth is a form of cancer when it reaches beyond a certain point. It's exponential in the sense it has to grow every year. A normal capitalist economy, capitalism being the major way in which we've organized our economies around the world, it's like a bicycle. It has to go and grow or it collapses. It has no steady state dimension. That's part of the problem of the unsustainability of capitalism. I've already mentioned that it's undifferentiated, makes no difference between purchases that add to human flourishing or not. And a very important point here, and I'm a post-growth economist, is that we're not talking about every sector of the economy having to degrow or contract. From an ecological point of view, the main issue is the macroeconomy. So long as the overall use of resources, pollution, and energy is within the same sustainable thresholds of the Earth system, you can have sectors of the society or the economy growing and some contracting. So the fossil fuel sector, that can contract, and it necessarily has to if we reach climate targets, but we could have a growth in kidney dialysis machines. So you mustn't understand a post-growth perspective or a degrowth perspective as meaning that every sector of the society has to contract. It is about saying, so long as the overall macroeconomy is within the sustainable limits of the climate and the ecosystem, bits of the economy can contract and expand as decided by the people, the government, or another way of organizing the economy. And then just to reiterate, the issue I'm questioning or proposing for you to consider is that why should growth be a permanent feature of the economy as to opposed being a net benefit and a necessity to bring people out of poverty, to provide more opportunities, more public investment, infrastructure in roads and hospitals, and so on. But why should the economy continually grow, particularly, and this links then to the inequality argument, what we've seen over the last particularly 30 years under what we sometimes call neoliberal capitalism, financialized, very globalized capitalism, is that the benefits of growth do not accrue to the majority in society. They accrue to the, maybe 10% or indeed in parts at times, the 1% of people in the society. From an economic point of view, that's neither here nor there. Economics from this perspective is indifferent to the distribution of the benefits of growth, where I think most of us perhaps on this call, for moral or political reasons, would have concerns about where that growth goes to. And actually, maybe a better solution for our societies in the global north is more redistribution, not necessarily more growth. Our societies are incredibly wealthy. The problem is that they're concentrated in their wealth in certain sectors of our society. Again, this is a very provocative way of putting it, but I do think it's a good way of making the point, is that Edward Abbey, very well-known green environmental writer in America in the 1970s, you can read there yourself, that's essentially what, from a medical term, what cancer is. They are the uncontrolled exponential increase in cell growth that then becomes unhealthy for the organism. And therefore, I would hold that we in the minority overdeveloped world, in Europe, as I said, North America, Australasia and Japan, we are now in a period of cancerous growth. And therefore, it's a negative, and therefore we need to move to a post-growth economy as the continuing growing in the way that we have done. So what is GDP, this gross domestic product? Well, it's goods and services that we produce in the economy, measured in financial terms over the course of a year. Goods, services such as education, bicycles, food and drink, and so on, these all add to GDP. But what also adds to GDP are things like divorce. Think about it. If a divorce happens and if there's children involved, now we need 2 houses, ching ching. Maybe an extra car now for mobility purposes to get around, ching ching. The children now need 2 sets of toys, ching ching. You have to employ barristers and lawyers, perhaps, ching ching. The economy is benefiting in all those trades and exchanges in goods and services, but most of us, I think, would see this as a negative. Why should something like the failure and breakdown of a marriage be seen as an economic benefit? Strangely enough, even pollution can add to growth. Yes, there can be a decrease in tourism or the income of fishing people, but actually paying lawyers and corporate executives to deal with this actually adds to GDP as well. And perhaps most morally troubling of all, wars add to GDP. You know, we have the evidence, whether it's the Korean War after the Second World War, the Vietnam War, even the Iraq War that we've seen in the early 2000s. All of these added to American GDP. In part because of the large size of its military industrial complex and so on. But you can see how wars are good. You know, even the current war in Ukraine has seen the stocks and shares of American military producers increase. And again, it's that issue that the GDP measure is morally blind. It is indifferent if you're buying guns or if you're buying kidney dialysis machines, as I mentioned earlier. But what's missing from GDP? Well, the unpaid work of mostly women, because that's not a traded commodity good. The cooking, the cleaning, the psychological counseling that many women give to men in the particularly, sexist division of labor within a society. I mean, it was put very well by a well-known economist, John Maynard Keynes, that some of you may have heard of. He said, GDP goes down when a man marries his maid. Now, he was talking about the 1920s, so we've forgiven, the language he used. But what he's talking about, the woman is still doing the same work now that she is this person's wife. Whereas before, as a maid, she was being paid for it. She's doing the same work now, unpaid. Why is that? Who made that decision? That the work that goes on in the home of raising children, of cooking and cleaning and all, why is that not part of our economic calculus? Why isn't the volunteer work that many of us are involved in, community gardens, helping in our communities, whether it's GAA or religious or charitable organizations, if money doesn't change hands, it doesn't get included in GDP. And that issue, who made that decision? Why is it that we're excluding the valuable work that keeps our societies going, particularly as we've experienced during the times of great stress like the pandemic? Yes, the state did come in and furlough workers and invested in personal protective equipment to protect frontline medical staff, but actually an awful lot of our citizens had their physical and mental health, enhanced, not because of what the state did, but because what volunteers, charities, and so on did. None of that gets included in GDP. Or indeed the work involved in keeping our democracies functioning. That is not included in our GDP. And again, it's that issue, why is it? Why are we so fixated on a measure which is not actually measuring what matters? That's the real question before us this morning. And there's nothing new in what I'm saying here. This is Robert Kennedy in a commencement address at a university, sadly 2 weeks before he was assassinated. And so back in the day, in the 60s, he was questioning gross domestic product in terms of, it doesn't measure the wisdom of our learning, our compassion, our patriotism and devotion to country. So, we're talking almost 50 years ago in 1968. And yet we still are only now, you could say, beginning more seriously the conversation of moving beyond GDP. And this is the problem, is that we have this fiction that, capitalism has caused the problem, but the market and technology will solve it. And apologies, this is a meme I picked off the internet, so the bad language, forgive me for it. But it really brings out that issue that we have this sense that we can decouple a continually growing economy from the use of resources and so on. But we have no evidence that that is the case. Yeah, it's almost like an article of faith, a form of, I would call it mythic or wishful thinking. And what we get mostly in Irish government and elsewhere is this idea of green growth, that we can continually have growth and we can, use technology to reduce carbon, reduce resources. And don't get me wrong, we will need technological innovation. But the problem is that we have no empirical evidence that our economies can continually grow at the rates they have done, and that more and more people in the world can enjoy those high levels of growth by the use of technology. It's what I call sometimes the biofueling the Hummer solution. So we have an unsustainable car, i.e. the economy, the big Hummer, and so you just take out the bad fossil fuels and put in green energy. But maybe the problem is the car itself. That's the point I'm making, not necessarily the fuel, never mind the fact that we have no empirical evidence that at the scale and urgency that is required, that we can decouple a growing economy from resource and pollution uses in the time frame that we have. So just to begin to wind up then, this is a wonderful book that some of you may know of. If you haven't, I definitely encourage you to read it. It's The Spirit Level by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, came out about 2008. And it's this idea that under capitalism in particular, growth is not evenly distributed, and it requires and also reproduces socioeconomic inequality. So if you're a believer in equality, growth may not be the strategy you need. Why not go straight to redistribution of the available wealth and resources in society? And you can see there that, the point that Wilkinson and Pickett are making is that growth is now causing more problems than it is solutions. Ecological problems, some of the issues that Colette raised in terms of increasing psychological distress within society. There's also the phenomenon that many of us are familiar with, for those of us that go shopping, that actually having such a multiplicity of choice in products actually can add to psychological distress, that having so many brands of shampoo doesn't actually improve our freedom, but that's how it's presented to us, this idea of capitalism providing more and more different types of goods, actually, causes some psychological distress, being overwhelmed with so much choice. And that there is a very interesting branch of social psychology called choice editing, that actually the modest reduction of choices available to us can be more healthy. While still giving us choice, do we need 100 types of shampoo as opposed to 10, for example? Again, the economic logic of capitalism and growth doesn't allow us to make those arguments. And the point that Pickett and Wilkinson are making is that it is in our societies that we've come to this long journey of growth. We need to move beyond growth to better, to move beyond quantitative measurements of a good life or a good society to more qualitative. And that, I think, is the challenge for the 21st century. And again, we need to ask ourselves this. I've mentioned it a few times now. We seriously have to question capitalism. And I certainly see it every year when I teach young people, that they literally have this apocalyptic vision. And sadly, a lot of our young people, although it's not just young people, they do have demonstrable, signs of climate and eco anxiety about the future. That's a lot of the motivations of those young people like Greta Thunberg and so on, who've taken to the streets to strike. They are suffering from forms of psychological anxiety. But for them, it's easier to imagine the end of the world in this apocalyptic vision. Although, as an aside, I would give 2 cheers to the apocalypse. If you go back etymologically to its ancient Greek words, the apocalypse is a lifting of the veil. It's a revelation. So that's something you might want to come back to. But I do think we have to start questioning the current way we organize our society, i.e. capitalism. And in particular, no relation, this is Wendell Berry as opposed to Barry. It's why isn't it that our leaders don't have the courage to face up to the truth? The science is pretty clear. We can't continue growing in the way that we have done. And yet our leaders are more willing to send our young people off to fight in wars than to ask us to become, Wendell Berry's term, less greedy, less consumptive. And we have to ask ourselves, why is that when the science is backing this up? Never mind the multiple moral arguments we can advance in terms of a better society, more equal society, societies focused on real human flourishing. So just to conclude, I think we need to absolutely decouple economic activity from carbon, particularly fossil fuels. There is a connection between everything I'm saying here and the war in Ukraine. When you buy Russian oil or gas, you are funding Putin's war machine. At the same time, the use of carbon energy is creating carbon dioxide, which is then propelling climate breakdown. So we absolutely need to move away from fossil fuels as quickly as we can. But more than that, and this is a real political, moral issue, to decouple human flourishing from economic growth. Up to a point, economic growth adds to human flourishing and well-being, opportunities and jobs. Then it passes a threshold where it becomes a net disbenefit. That's the point that I'm making. So don't take what I'm saying today as an anti-growth position. It's a post-growth position. Up to a point, growth is good. After that, then it becomes a negative. And what do we want? And the Republic of Ireland in particular has seen this. We have seen astronomical figures, over 20% growth in the Irish economy, but actually no jobs coming from it. So we've had jobless growth. Well, you can say, what's the point of that? It means that very wealthy shareholders and multinational companies are doing very well, but indigenous, local, native Irish people are not getting any jobs from this. Or do we want to move to what I call here a work-rich post-growth? There's lots of work that needs to be done to repair the earth, reknit communities, lots of work to be done. So it's not as if a future beyond growth means there's less work to be done. It just means it's different work, and perhaps work that up until now hasn't been recognized in our formal economic calculus. And I do think, many of us would have an intuitive sense of this, that there would be a limit to this quantitative material, consuming more and more goods and services. There are limits to the material dimensions of what's available on the planet for us to have a good life, but also there are limits to that materialist view of the good life. I mean, most of the great religions are united on this in terms of, the limits of that materialist view of, a good life. As far as I know, and this is an open question we can discuss, there are no limits to the qualitative dimensions of human development and experience, education, love, community, joy, meaningful free time. These are the things that I think our public policy needs to be focused on. Absolutely, we need to fulfill the basic needs of people in terms of housing, in terms of food and transportation, not least in the context of cost of living crisis. But I think those things can be done without growth. It's about redistribution. We have lots of wealth, as I said, in society, lots of resources, but they are being accumulated by a small minority. We need to face up to the issue that redistribution is a much more morally satisfying, more egalitarian, and certainly more climate-friendly way of addressing the material needs of our community. So I'll leave it there, and I look forward to hearing what Anne has to say. Thanks for listening.